Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Friday, March 21st, 2025. Why we don't remember being babies. Brain scans reveal new clues. Yale cognitive neuroscientist Nick Turk-Brown works with a baby and parent during a brain scan. Tristan Yates has no doubt about her first memory, even if it is a little fuzzy. I was about 3.5 in Callaway Gardens in Georgia, she recalls, just running around with my twin sister trying to pick up Easter eggs. But she has zero memories before that, which is typical. The amnesia of our babyhood is pretty much the rule. We have memories from what happened earlier today, and memories from what happened earlier last week, and even from a few years ago, says Yates, who's cognitive neuroscientist at Columbia University. But all of us lack memories from our infancy. Is that because we don't make memories when we're babies? Or is there something else responsible? Now, in new research, published by Yates and her colleagues in the journal Science, they propose that babies are able to form memories, even if they become inaccessible later in life. These results might reveal something crucial about the earliest moments of our development. That's the time when we learn who our parents are. That's when we learn language. That's when we learn how to talk, Yates said. What happens in your brain in the first 2 years of life is magnificent, says Nick Turk-Brown, a cognitive neuroscientist at Yale University. That's the period of by far the greatest plasticity across your whole lifespan. And better understanding how your brain learns and remembers in infancy lays the foundation for everything you know and do for the rest of your life. Babies are the worst subjects. The reason we don't know much about infant memories, one of the best ways to look deep in the brain is with an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, which requires a person to remain still for an extended period of time. But just try to get a baby to cooperate with that. Infants, in many ways, are the worst possible subject population, admits Turk-Brown. They don't understand instructions. It's like taking a photograph. You get a blurry picture, so you can't move a millimeter. And also, they have a really short attention span, so we had to adapt. Turk-Brown and his colleagues have spent nearly a decade trying to figure out how to do fMRI research on babies. They have come up with sorts of tricks to keep them happy and engaged. If they cry, the experiment stops, so the baby can play or go for a walk. We have them bring comfort items, like a pacifier, or blankets, or a toy, he says. I've given babies a bottle during these scans. The researchers nestled the babies in bedding. The child's parent is always in the room with them, and the tasks required them are short. It's the only way to be able to ask what's going on in the infant's mind, despite not being able to ask them questions, says Turk-Brown. You can look at their brain, and their brain has the answers. Screen time in the name of science. Here's how this particular experiment went down. The babies were shown a video inside the fMRI machine. Throughout the background displays a green kaleidoscope pattern. This kind of psychedelic screen meant to have infants fixate towards the center of their screen, says Yates. Then one image at a time appears for 2 seconds before disappearing. These are images that have never been seen before. A canyon, a dog toy, a woman's face. About a minute later, Yates, we showed them one image they just saw alongside a different image from the same category. That could so be the canyon, say alongside a waterfall. If the baby remembered seeing the canyon earlier, the child will look longer at the canyon than at the waterfall. It's as if you're still learning about it. So you're looking at it more, says Turk Brown. It's only really when they have a preference for the familiar thing, and we take that evidence of successful memory formation. This procedure gave the researchers an indication as to which images the baby remembered and which they forgot. Meanwhile, the fMRI was snapping pictures of the baby's brain, including its hippocampus, a region that we know is super important for memory in adults, says Yates. The scans revealed that starting at about 12 months of age, the more activity there was in the baby's hippocampus when seeing an image for the first time, like the canyon, the more likely they are to remember that image later. What we're able to conclude is that the hippocampus can encode individual memories, even in human infants, says Yates. She and her colleagues say it's evidence that a memory has formed in the baby's hippocampus, unlocking our earliest memories. These results allow scientists to put the timestamp for our first memory of a little bit earlier than we thought possible, says Flavio Donato, a neurobiologist at the University of Basel who wasn't involved in the research. He says it now appears that infancy isn't a passive, forgettable stage of our lives. A relevant consideration for how we raise and educate children, and even how we understand early trauma or stress. It's an important question, says Donato. How these traumatic events might lead to memories or traces in the brain that might persist for a long time and might even influence the way in which this person will develop. There's still a lot to figure out. Just how durable are the memories we may be storing as infants? And if they're still there, locked away in our older brains, are they forever off limits? The question is, asks Turk Brown, could you circumvent that in some way to help kids? Or adults even? Potentially reactive old memories. To try to answer this question, the researchers are performing another study in which they ask families to record home videos from their baby's perspective. Later in the lab, when they play those videos for the infants, they will look to see what's happening in the infant's hippocampus and just how long the earliest memories may persist. 3 people face federal charges for Tesla attacks. Are such acts domestic terrorism? An investigator looks over the scene at a Tesla collision center after a person used incendiary devices to set several vehicles on Tuesday, in Las Vegas. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department said that 5 Teslas were damaged and believed that the suspect fired 3 rounds from a firearm at the vehicles and spray painted the word "resist" on the entrance. The Department of Justice announced charges Thursday against 3 people it says are allegedly responsible for violent attacks targeting Elon Musk's Tesla cars, showrooms, in charging stations across the country. The Justice Department says 3 people in Charleston, South Carolina, Loveland, Colorado, and Salem, Oregon are facing criminal charges that carry a minimum penalty of 5 years and up to 20 years in prison for a range of violent acts. They include using Molotov cocktails to set fire to Tesla cars and charging stations and processing other incendiary devices, and a suppressed AR-15 rifle. U.S. Attorney Pam Bondi said in a statement Thursday, "The days of committing crimes without consequence have ended." Bondi said, "Let this be a warning. If you join this wave of domestic terrorism against Tesla properties, the Department of Justice will put you behind bars." President Trump and White House senior advisor, Tesla and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk delivered remarks next to a Tesla Model S on the South Lawn of the White House on March 11th in Washington, D.C. The strong statement came less than 2 days after Bondi promised that such attacks on Tesla would be considered nothing short of domestic terrorism. A representative for the DOJ didn't immediately respond to NPR's additional questions on what the agency plans to do next on this issue. Trump, for his part, was criticized the attacks and efforts to boycott Musk's companies, and last week said he would purchase a Tesla vehicle to support his advisor. In Las Vegas, police said Tuesday that 5 Teslas were damaged in an attack on a sales and service center. Police believe the suspect also shot a gun at the cars and spray painted the word "resist" on the entrance. No one was injured, which was also the case in Colorado, Oregon, and South Carolina incidents. While no one has been injured or killed by these attacks, 3 professors and researchers of domestic terrorism and extremism tell NPR that they consider these acts to be acts of domestic terrorism. It's absolutely domestic terrorism. I know that may discomfort many people, but vandalism is a crime that, if it's committed with political motive, can certainly be defined as terrorism, says Bruce Hoffman, Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council of Foreign Relations. He is the co-author of the forthcoming book, God, Guns, and Sedation: Far-Right Terrorism in America. These days, the concept of domestic terrorism has become increasingly complex, Hoffman says. While there are official definitions of domestic terrorism, there is no federal law on the matter. Here's a breakdown of what constitutes domestic terrorism, how the U.S. has approached this issue in the past, and why it's important despite the lack of specific law. Why are Tesla and Musk the target of vandalism? Public anger toward Musk, a White House advisor, Tesla and SpaceX CEO, and one of the world's richest men, is growing as he leads efforts to slash government spending with his Department of Government Efficiency team. So far, this Trump administration entity has orchestrated the mass firings of thousands of government workers across multiple agencies in the past month. In response, a grassroots protest has emerged in the form of #TeslaTakedown movement. It is calling on Tesla drivers to sell their cars, dump company stock, and join picket lines at Tesla showrooms. People protesting Musk's actions in the Trump administration hold signs outside a Tesla showroom in Seattle on February 13th. But in some cases, including one of the people, including in Bondi's announcement Thursday, the protests have taken a more violent turn. Two people have been arrested and are now facing state and federal charges tied to two separate attacks on a Tesla dealership in Loveland, Colorado, which painting expletive-ridden messages, which involved throwing Molotov cocktails at the cars, and in one instance, spray-painted expletive-ridden messages on the showroom's windows. No one was killed or injured during either incident. Who is facing charges? Lucy Grace Nelson, Daniel Burden Kurt, Clark Pounder, and Adam Matthew Lansky are facing charges tied to their alleged vandalism of Tesla cars and dealerships in Colorado, South Carolina, and Oregon, respectively. Nelson is facing 2 charges of possession of an unregistered firearm and the malicious attempt destruction of property. She could face up to 30 years in prison. Court documents allege that Nelson traveled to a Tesla dealership in Loveland, Colorado, on multiple nights in January and February, allegedly lighting Molotov cocktails and throwing them in the dealership's parking lot and spraying graffiti on the building's windows and walls. Nelson's attorney, Mary V. Butterton, declined a comment on her client's case. Lansky is facing 1 charge of unlawful possession of an unregistered firearm, but an affidavit alleges he is also responsible for throwing Molotov cocktails and shooting a gun at Tesla vehicles and a dealership facilities in Salem, Oregon, on at least 2 separate occasions in January and February. Lansky's attorney, Mark Patrick Allmeyer, didn't immediately respond to a request for a comment. Court documents allege that witnesses say they saw Clark Pounder on March 7th using red spray paint to write obscenities against Trump and Long Live Ukraine on a Tesla charging station parking spot in North Charleston. S.C. Park Clark Pounder then alleged started lighting bottles on fire and throwing them at the Tesla charging stations, according to court documents. He's facing 1 charge of arson affecting interstate commerce. Patrick Chisholm, Clark Pounder's attorney, General Bondi's statement is kind of becoming self-evident. Both he and his family are very, very concerned and very scared, Chisholm said. He added that his client is a troubled young man who's been suffering from multiple mental health issues. What falls under domestic terrorism? The U.S. doesn't have a standalone federal domestic terrorism law, but at least 32 states and Washington, D.C. have their own state-level domestic terrorism laws. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and/or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influence, such as those of political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. People might look at vandalism at Tesla dealership and question whether it's terrorism, says Hoffman. But going back to 1990, the FBI, as the lead agency responsible for investigating terrorism in the United States, has investigated acts of vandalism and arson like those committed by eco-terrorism groups and treated them as domestic terrorism, he says. One more of these famous cases of eco-terrorism was committed by the group known as the Family. The FBI says the group has been linked to more than 40 criminal acts between 1995 and 2001, including arson and vandalism, causing more than $45 million in damages. The group's most notorious act was the 1998 arson attack on a ski resort in Vail, Colorado, which caused around $26 million in damages. To me, regardless of one's opinions of Tesla cars and its owner, this isn't new, Hoffman says. A key element of determining what is domestic terrorism is the intent of the perpetrator. That can include a desire to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence government policy, or affect government conduct, says Faisha Patel, Senior Director of the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. And the intent of the Tesla vandals falls under his umbrella. Under this umbrella, she says. The whole point is that the vandals are trying to influence government conduct. Everybody knows that Elon Musk is not a federal employee, but is at the center of a lot of controversies about the government is doing right now, Patel says. The act would also have to fall under one of the laws listed in the federal code as domestic terrorism offense. These include attacks that use certain types of weapons. For example, weapons of mass destruction, or include acts such as hostage taking, or involve special federal interest, such as attacks on federal officials. Other protesters have spray painted swastikas and smashed windows of Tesla showrooms. But Patel says it's unlikely authorities will consider those cases of petty vandalism or of someone keying a Tesla to be domestic terrorism. Investigators look over at the scene of the Tesla Collision Center after a person set several vehicles on fire on Tuesday in Las Vegas. While the U.S. doesn't have a federal domestic terrorism law, extremism experts have long warned that domestic terrorism, mainly coming from far-right and white supremacy groups, pose a far greater threat than foreign terrorism. Still, despite sporadic efforts to do so, no federal domestic terrorism law has been created due to a lack of consensus. Because of this, people involved in acts determined to be domestic terrorism are still charged with offenses such as arson, murder, kidnapping, and assault. The perpetrators of the most famous incident of U.S. domestic terrorism, the Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, were never actually charged with domestic terrorism. Rather, Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirator, Terry L. Nichols, were found guilty of several counts of murder and the use of a weapon of mass destruction, or conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. of mass destruction. Although there is no federal domestic terrorism law, prosecutors can point to perpetrators' motive to classify a crime as terrorism during a trial and sentencing, which can affect a convicted person's punishment, says Laura Dungan, a professor of human security and professor of sociology at the Ohio State University. If a crime is determined to be an act of terrorism, a perpetrator could receive additional years on their sentence. Even after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was never enough agreement in Congress to support domestic terrorism law, Hoffman said. It was always considered a highly politicized issue, he says. When you walked into a room going back to the 1990s and you talked about domestic terrorism, there was a lot of the half room that was immediately thought far left radicals. And there was another half of the room that immediately thought white supremacists or seditious-minded conspiracy believers, Hoffman says. Hoffman believes it's a huge problem and that the U.S. has no domestic terrorism statute. But Patel, whose Brennan Center has long opposed such law, says this would only be weaponized by the federal government and would make it too easy for an administration to label unpopular groups or political enemies as a domestic terrorist outfit. I don't see how it benefits anybody, she says. Given how polarized our current political environment is, it seems to be a particularly bad idea.